Hello students, welcome back to today's class, and today we will see how the dietary guidelines are and their quality. So, dietary guidelines are statements that assist populations for choosing foods that deliver optimal nutrient intake and are associated with reducing risk of non-communicable diseases. The evidence supporting the guidelines has a broad base, but focuses on the relation between food consumption and disease prevention. From this evidence base, diet models can be constructed and translated into food guidance tools, including diagrammatic representations such as plates or pyramids are associated with reduced risk of the communicable diseases. Foods deliver energy and nutrients. Nutrients are components of foods that are essential for human health, but other compounds continue to be identified as foods, and their health properties are becoming better understood. The nutrient function is reported in the literature, but the nutrient composition of foods varies considerably. In addition, not all nutritional compounds with foods have been fully studied, and there are likely synergistic interaction between the components within any given food. These same issues are also reflected in our current understanding of dietary patterns regularly consumed by any individual. This critical interrelation between nutrients, foods and dietary patterns has important implications for the development of dietary guidelines to improve health and prevent disease. The evidence review underpinning dietary guidelines is a synthesis and evaluation of best scientific evidence for the relation between diet and health. The evidence base as subject to the available science at any particular point of time, but problems may arise when the correctness between nutrients, foods and dietary patterns is not fully appreciated or is inadequately aligned to form a coherent position. This may be the case in current debates on the relation between the risk of heart disease and dietary fat as opposed to food sources of fat such as nuts and oil, olive oil, dietary patterns rich in fat and such as Mediterranean or Western diets. It can also reflect a translational problem in which evidence that is obtained from the basic sciences is part of a value chain of knowledge. At one end of the value chain are the questions on disease mechanisms that are largely addressed by the studies of nutrient actions. At the center are the trials testing the effects of single foods or dietary patterns on health outcomes or epidemiological studies and exposing these relations, and on the other hand are efficacy trials testing the impact of dietary advice strategies on behavior or clinical endpoints. So, the interaction between nutrients, foods and diets play out across this spectrum in the formulation of dietary guidelines, and we largely focus on cardiovascular disease as a referent health outcome. Now, we argue that the development of dietary guidelines is a translational in nature, but the foundation of this exercise lies in the identification of healthy dietary patterns. The association between diet and health is underpinned by an interdependent relation between dietary patterns, foods and food components including nutrients. Diets are composed of foods which in turn are composed of nutrients and other food components. Whereas eating food is essential to health, support for the human physiological system, and it is based on the nutrient requirements. The inadequate consumption of vitamins can lead to deficiencies, and overconsumption of macronutrients can lead to obesity. So, both positive and negative effects are relevant. So, to consider this, because of the burdens of the disease for nutrition have been shifted. The focus of the study in nutritional epidemiology traditionally has been on nutrients and other food components. This arose when the undernutrition and nutritional deficiencies were the prevailing diet induced disease state. However, demographic and epidemiological transitions have been seen in high income countries and underway in most low and middle income countries. These have switched disease burdens, and chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease, cancer and diabetes now account for 70% of the mortality and 58% of morbidity in terms of disability adjusted life years. And globally this is the scenario, with the leading cause of death being ischemic heart disease followed by stroke. This changed paradigm has resulted in part of shifts in the food environment. The dietary determinants of these diseases differ from those of undernutrition and nutrient deficiencies that result from insufficient intake or absorption of a particular nutrient. The non-communicable diseases have multiple interacting dietary determinants consisting of excess or insufficient intake, and they cumulatively affect the disease risk over decades. Consequently, nutritional epidemiologic investigations of these diseases have gone beyond the single nutrient approach, focusing on foods and food groups, and more recently evaluating the effect of overall diet. So, furthermore, diets focusing on single nutrients have had negative consequences, and the past few decades have witnessed inadequacy of primarily reductionist approach to chronic disease prevention. Now, a limited focus concurred with the emergence of nutrients defined diets such as low fat and low carbohydrate diets. The trend towards low fat, high carbohydrate diets, which advocated a reduction in total fat consumption without paying attention to the type or quality of fat, led to excess intake of refined carbohydrates and added sugars, which, as now we know, that can actually increase the risk of cardiometabolic diseases. So, in fact, substitution analysis have indicated that the effects of one macronutrient on non-communicable disease risk largely depends upon the replacement of macronutrient. A reductionist approach that focuses on only one nutrient is especially dangerous because it often fails to consider these substitution effects and the associated foods. In weight stable populations in particular, in which the changes in macronutrient composition occurs in isocaloric conditions, when testing the effects of reducing dietary macronutrient, we must consider the alternative macronutrient and its food sources. First, for instance, higher dietary saturated fat is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease when it replaces dietary polyunsaturated fats or carbohydrates from high quality foods such as whole grains. but there is no association when it replaces dietary carbohydrates from highly refined foods. So, that means you have to take a replacement with the whole grains, and a low fat diet thus would have divergent effects on heart health depending upon the constituent foods delivering fats and carbohydrates. Hence, there is no effect of a macronutrient in an absolute sense, because this may change based on the replacement nutrients and the foods that deliver them. Dietary guidelines that are based on cohesive dietary patterns have the advantage of inherently capturing these substitution effects. After consideration is that synergistic or antagonistic interaction exists between nutrients within the dietary patterns. For a nutrient perspective, this has been known for some time. For example, with enhanced absorption of non-heme iron in the presence of vitamin C and competitive inhibition of zinc absorption by iron. Both are working in opposite manners. So, the presence of vitamin C enhances the non-heme iron absorption. There is inhibition of zinc absorption because of iron. So, from this perspective of dietary pattern, however, focusing on isolated nutrients cannot account for interactions and may result in erroneous conclusions. Important associations may be missed, or the effects may be assumed in which none exists. In the past, for example, a high cholesterol concentration found in eggs were behind the widespread recommendation to reduce egg intake for heart health. However, eggs are rich in amino acids and several micronutrients, and the combined effect of cholesterol and these nutrients is likely to be different than that of cholesterol alone. In fact, recent findings show that consuming up to 1 egg per day has no effect on cardiovascular disease risk. Dietary recommendations based on an evaluation starting with dietary patterns can implicitly account for interactions that are often difficult to identify. Finally, people choose to eat foods, not nutrients, and findings on the nutritional research on foods and dietary patterns are more amenable to translation and public health practice. These findings can be translated into dietary guidelines and policy applications even before the mechanisms underlying the observed associations are fully understood. In addition, dietary recommendations based on foods and dietary patterns are likely to be accessible because it would be easier for people to understand and adopt the recommendations regarding cohesive dietary patterns and opposed to those regarding a number of different nutrients. So, to put all this in the context, the 2015 US Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee evaluated the effect of total diet on several health outcomes in its report. Based on the systemic review of this evidence to date, the committee identified 3 dietary patterns that are associated with reduced risk of chronic diseases and improved diet quality. One is the healthy US style pattern, then the healthy Mediterranean style pattern, and healthy vegetarian pattern. Importantly, these patterns have several elements in common, in particular a higher intake of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts and legumes, a moderate intake of alcohol and lower intake of red and processed meats, sugar sweetened foods and drinks, and refined grains. The DGAC review showed that the core features of a healthy diet can be obtained through many different healthy dietary patterns, potentially accommodating varying individual needs and socio-cultural preferences. Having identified healthy dietary patterns, research on nutrients and food components will always be important, not least because it is impossible to separate out nutrients from foods and foods from dietary patterns in this context. There is an important interactive relation that needs to be a part of the analysis. Now, dietary pattern research is unable to identify the nutrients or interaction patterns involved in disease etiology. So, nutrient based research is needed to isolate the true causative agents. Nutrient focused research enhances the mechanistic understanding of food and diet effects. A consideration of nutrients serves the purpose of disseminating knowledge about essential nutrients and the quantities required from foods. This is especially important because poor food choices can result in suboptimal nutrient intake. Thus, guidelines can discuss how nutrients have an input on health and as well as address the way to consume them optimally through appropriate food choices. Taking this argument further, the concept of nutrient poor to discretionary food expose the significance of nutrients in the diet health debate. Foods are considered to be discretionary when they do not provide enough limited nutrients, but are high in calories as well as in the saturated fat, added sugar and sodium. For example, sugar sweetened beverages which are mostly liked by all the adults and children than the sweets and other processed foods. These later components tend to enhance the food shelf life while increasing the palatability and can be easily manipulated and added to foods during processing. Unsurprisingly, the food supply is replete with discretionary food. Even otherwise, healthy foods can become unhealthy through the addition of ingredients. Discretionary foods deserve separate and more detailed consideration in the development of dietary guidelines. This is the beginning to emerge, with categorization of processed foods becoming more prevalent in the literature and the underpinning dietary guidelines recently released in Brazil. This effort in turn can be used to inform policy and food regulations to ensure that quality of foods available in the supply system needs certain standards. To put this in context, since 2005, the US dietary guidelines have recommended a 10% upper limit of total dietary saturated fat. Although this is a nutrient based dietary recommendation, it has implications for discretionary food in particular, and the 2015 US DGAC reports support retaining this recommendation. As discussed, the application of this nutrient limit needs to consider carefully alternative food choices, particularly as a limit relates to the carbohydrate rich foods. Retaining the limit on saturated fat remains justified because the evidence base continues to support the benefits of replacing saturated fats with unsaturated fats. Given how easily saturated fat can be added to foods, meals and habitual diets in the form of butter, cooking fats or processed and packaged foods, a focus on this nutrient covers a range of foods that individuals need to be aware of in making healthy food choices. It can also help set appropriate meal standards for school and other programs. Finally, it is important to acknowledge unique aspects of foods and the food compounds that may affect disease risk independent of the overall diet. This may be the case in disease in which one nutrient is predominant etiologically relevant dietary component. Example, folate intake for the prevention of neural tube defects and trans fatty acids from partially hydrogenated oils and heart disease risk. In these cases, a focus on nutrients may be important when making recommendations tailored to the at-risk populations such as pregnant women and older people. Because in pregnant women, if there is folic acid deficiency, it definitely leads to neural tube disorder in the outcome of the pregnancy. Then formulating dietary guidelines should begin with evidence of relation between dietary patterns and health outcomes. Previously referred to as top-down approach, starting with dietary patterns, then foods, then nutrients, enables greater accuracy between dietary guidance and research outcomes. This is a systematic approach that acknowledges and works with the fact that dietary patterns, foods and nutrients, all these are interrelated. Dietary patterns expose the health attributes of certain food groups. Currently, foods such as vegetables, fruits, nuts, legumes, whole grains and olive oil consistently have emerged as an important food in dietary patterns, supportive of weight control and prevention of non-communicable diseases. Inverse association with weight gain over a 4-year period have been shown for the intake of vegetables, whole grains, fruits, nuts and yogurt. In a recent meta-analysis in which healthy dietary patterns were shown to be associated with significantly lower blood pressure, key foods were identified as vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, seeds, nuts, fish and low fat dietary foods. Thus, research indicates that consistency in the categories of foods that form healthy dietary patterns, and this would be forming a logical basis for evaluation of dietary guidelines. Now, consider the action of nutrients present in these foods. The relative influence of each food may be revealed by a consideration of nutrient effects. For example, the beneficial effects of nuts and seeds are likely to be attributed to high amounts of unsaturated fats, soluble fiber, plant protein, vitamins, minerals and phytochemicals present in them, although separating the effects of individual components is extremely difficult because of its synergistic effect of multiple components. Now, the Mediterranean diet is the one which is most reported in the scientific literature. We have learned that the positive effects of cardiovascular health are relatively consistent, and over time the research has helped us to improve the study designs. Importantly, this diet and its components have demonstrated the feasibility and value of starting with research on dietary patterns and then moving down to the considerations of individual foods and the effects of nutrients contained in them. The consumption of fish has long been associated with improved cardiovascular health. A meta-analysis showed significant reductions in the risk of coronary heart disease mortality with both low means 1 serving per week, and moderate, which means 2 to 4 servings per week of fish. This beneficial effects of fish consumption on cardiovascular outcomes traditionally have been attributed to the long chain N3 PUFA, but fish also contains other nutrients like protein, vitamin D, selenium that may be interacting synergistically to deliver the cardiovascular outcomes. Although long chain N3 PUFAs may modulate cardiovascular disease risk, through the reduction of plasma triglycerides and platelet aggregation, and via anti-inflammatory effects. Preliminary evidence comparing consumption of fish with long chain N3 PUFA supplements suggests that consumption of whole food may deliver additional benefits not obtained with single nutrient supplementation. That means, a fish which contains N3 PUFA along with the other nutrients may be showing the beneficial effects instead of giving supplementation with long chain N3 PUFA. Although there is a clearly evidence of dietary patterns that are associated with reduced disease risk, certain dietary patterns or components also can be detrimental. Establishing evidence of dietary patterns that appear to be deleterious is more problematic. Trials of deleterious effects carry ethical problems, and the very wide range of foods appearing to be implicated makes them more difficult to conduct. They have associated dietary patterns characterized by excess dietary saturated fat, sodium and added sugars with increased disease risk. One way of dealing with deleterious dietary patterns is to examine the underpinnings of poor dietary quality. Foods that are high in saturated fatty acids, sugar and sodium are beginning to emerge as markers of poor diet quality. These ingredients are used substantially in food processing, and they appear in a very wide range of foods and beverages. In case of sugar, that are difficult to classify. For a nutrient perspective, only sodium represents a single chemical entity with a defined physiological role. There is a strong evidence of a dose-response relationship between increasing sodium intake and increased blood pressure that underpins national efforts to set informative dietary reference values. Saturated fat represents a class of fatty acids, and research implies that not all in the class have the same deleterious effects. This may reflect differences in food source, and in any case, people consume a major risk factor, not the individual fatty acids. However, some saturated fatty acids increase LDL cholesterol concentration, which is a major risk factor for heart disease. Although high dietary saturated fat also may be a marker for poor food choices. Evaluating the evidence based on these new food components is a key consideration of dietary guidelines, because as with added sugar, these components could be associated with deleterious effect on health. A prime example is trans fatty acids, which were developed first to stabilize vegetable fat at room temperature. Their shelf stable property and affordability made them popular in food manufacturing processes in the early 20th century. However, epidemiological and experimental evidence soon accumulated the demonstration of their strong and consistent association with increased risk of cardiometabolic disease. So, now the trans fat consumption is said to be dangerous to the cardiovascular system. To put these issues in context, historically trans fatty acids were first mentioned in the US dietary guidelines in 2000, with clear recommendations to reduce their intake being endorsed 5 years later. Meanwhile, the FDA approved a proposal for the manufacturers to list trans fatty acids in the nutrition facts panel, and in 2013 they took preliminary steps to phase out trans fatty acids altogether by deeming them to be not generally recognized as safe. A focus on food components in scientific research and in developing the dietary guidelines was essential for each of these actions. On the issue of added sugars, the 2015 US DGAC report recommended they reduce adding sugar intake to less than 10% of the total calories per day. This would mean that a revision in the nutrient facts panel proposed by the FDA to display the total amount of added sugar in food products would receive strong backing. From the study design perspective, dietary patterns deleterious to health tend to be exposed through epidemiological studies and with the use of exploratory methods such as factor analysis and cluster analysis. In these cases, dietary patterns characterized by foods high in saturated fat, sodium and or added sugar tend to emerge as negatively associated with health. Some foods have been implicated in epidemiological studies, and for example, an analysis of the nurses' health study and health professionals follow-up study showed that weight gain over a 4-year period was positively associated with higher intake of potato chips, sugar sweetened beverages and processed meats. These foods are also considered to be ultra processed foods. Research such as these analyses will support the evidence base that provides more detail in identifying discretionary foods as actual foods rather than being defined simply by nutrient means. Although debates remain on the negative consequences of over consuming saturated fat, sodium and sugar, if the focus were to shift on identifying foods that contain excess amount of these components and relative position of these foods in total dietary pattern, the situation may become clearer for consumers. Because saturated fat, sugar and salt are common ingredients in manufactured foods, the implications are important both for the development of dietary guidelines and their practical application. Starting with the evidence for dietary patterns, then adding component foods and associated nutrients provides a valid systematic approach to the development of food-based dietary guidelines. Reviews of evidence underpinning dietary guidelines consider the totality of the amount of scientific evidence available. Now, guidelines for grading the literature typically consider RCT to provide the highest level of scientific evidence, although some guidelines allow for upgrading the evidence from high quality observational studies in which strong and consistent effects are found. The grading of these levels is based on drug based trials, although these differ substantially from food based trials. Central tenets of RCT design such as double blinding and use of placebos are relatively simple to plan and maintain in drug based trials, but can be highly problematic when it is intervention with food. Although poor compliance with interventions can confound the results of both food and drug based RCT, the position of food as major element of daily life with both cultural and biological roles means that maintaining compliance over a long run can be challenging. In addition, food based interventions may not be feasible because of cost and ethical considerations. Therefore, although RCTs have clear advantages in terms of confounding to interventions such as controlled diets, aspects of typical RCT design may not lend themselves well to exploring long term relations between diet and disease. Although confounding cannot be ruled out completely, in the observational studies, the convergence of data from the observational studies and small RCTs on intermediate outcomes would strengthen the evidence based and enhance robustness of dietary recommendations. Dietary guidelines are instruments of public health policy that target the prevention of non-communicable diseases. This is underpinned by known causal links between poor diet quality and morbidity or mortality. The final stage in the translation involves the translation of guidelines into practical foods. Simple foods such as an apple are easily identified and associated with the guidelines. An apple as an ingredient is a mixed food becomes problematic. The concept of discretionary foods and extra foods is often used to create this distinction. These foods do not fit into the core food groups and tend to be processed foods high in energy, saturated fat, added sugars, added salt or alcohol. Thus, whereas an apple may be a preferred food, a piece of apple pie may be discretionary. From a nutritional perspective, the difference is readily articulated by the nutrient means. An apple pie is a processed food that likely contains more saturated fat, sugar, sodium than the original reference food and will contribute to these variables in the total diet. In a similar fashion, if most of the foods in the diets are chosen as mixed versions of the original, the total consumption of saturated fat, sugar and sodium may end up being very high. The problem of reflected in the current guidelines, for example, in 2013, the Australian Dietary Guidelines lists nutritious foods with actual food names, but the foods to limit categories appears in terms of deleterious nutrient composition. The dietary modeling for foundation diets is based on foods to enjoy and foods to limit are referred to as discretionary. Some years later, the evidence reviewed by the 2015 DGAC, they suggested that a healthy dietary pattern is higher in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, non-fat or low-fat dairy products, seafood, legumes and nuts, and contains moderate amounts of alcohol and is low in processed or red meat, sugar sweetened products and refined grains. And the fundamental interconnections between the nutrients, foods and diets suggests that the formulation of dietary guideline should begin with dietary patterns and then work down through identifying the component foods and explaining effects through their nutritive composition. Because of the development of dietary guidelines is translational in nature, the focus on dietary patterns and their inherent foods enables direct translation to advice statements while not ignoring the key nutrients that may signal overall quality of the diet. The complex interconnections between nutrients, food and dietary patterns imply that no single element of diet can provide a complete picture of dietary effects on health, but a systematic approach to reviewing the evidence starting with dietary patterns is warranted. As demonstrated by the 2015 US DGAC report, healthy patterns, foods and food components do overlap, which provides a sound scientific basis for comprehensive dietary guidelines, and DGAC also spelled out unhealthy choice in terms of foods, not just nutrients, and this is important for the public to understand and act upon. Although foods in healthy dietary pattern are readily identifiable, the combinations of these foods tend to reflect moderate amounts of saturated fat, sodium and added sugars. Food with high amounts of these components tend to emerge as being associated with negative health outcomes, and the evidence of foods to consume compare with the foods to limit is likely to present in different ways. The food industry must be held accountable and responsible for maintaining and managing the supply of marketing of these foods, and the scientists must continue to develop research that underpins dietary guidelines, a framework that recognizes the interrelation between dietary patterns, foods and nutrients provides a workable platform for driving this effort forward. So, to summarize, the dietary patterns, foods and nutrients are inexorably linked, and dietary patterns comprise of foods and foods deliver nutrients. Dietary patterns should be the starting point for evaluating scientific evidence underpinning dietary guidelines, and dietary guidelines are set of statements that together reflect healthy dietary pattern. The burden of disease has shifted to condition in which multiple dietary factors and total energy are implicated. Dietary patterns address these issues, and nutrient defined diets, that is low fat or low carbohydrate, are confounded by the food sources of macronutrients, because the effects of one macronutrient on NCD risk largely depends on the replacement macronutrient, and synergy exists across the combination of foods. Dietary patterns readily translatable to dietary advice. People choose to eat foods, not nutrients. And reviewing the evidence of nutrients is an important subsequent step in the development of dietary guidelines. Research on nutrients is required to understand potential mechanisms of action and to isolate causative agents underpinning the evidence of effects of food consumption within the dietary patterns. Advice on healthy food choices references nutrition quality, which is described in terms of nutrient content. So, these foods are readily identifiable and tend to be fresh and less processed. Advice on unhealthy food choices is defined in terms of excessive delivery of nutrients or other food components. These foods are less readily identifiable and tend to be processed foods. They can be constitute large proportion of food supply and food consumption patterns in the population. Evidence of dietary patterns, foods and nutrients is available in scientific literature and needs to be addressed in strategic and systematic manner. And primary and secondary analysis of large dietary trials such as pre-dimed trial exemplify how to set analysis can be conducted. This needs to be broadened to a wider range of food and dietary patterns. The evidence of deleterious eating patterns is emerging in different ways. More research is required on characterizing actual foods to enable guidance to be more specific and recognizable by the consumers. Established system of quality review of the body of evidence can be layered onto staged framework examining the evidence for dietary patterns, foods and then nutrients. Then translating the evidence requires a clear reference to foods. The concept of discretionary foods requires more research and has strong implications for food regulation standards and food industry as a whole. So, this shows that the food has to be eaten as a wholesome and the deleterious foods have to be avoided or eaten in minimum, and more of fresh foods and less of processed foods to be eaten. Thank you.